Hi, everyone. It's great to see you here, and it's great to see that everyone is so excited to talk to each other. So I'm Kasia Rachuta. I currently work as a data science tech lead at Square, and I will be doing a presentation on how to overcome some of the challenges and pitfalls in A/B testing that you may run into. So here's my talk outline. I'm going to do an intro. I'm going to talk a little bit about what is A/B testing and what the design is, which I assume most of you will be familiar with. Then I will go into the actual pitfalls and best practices, and that will be the bulk of my talk. So why am I delivering this talk, and what is it about? So I hold a master's in theoretical physics from University College London. I've been in the industry for over 8 years. As I mentioned, I currently work as a data science tech lead at Square. And previously, I worked at Medium and FiveStars. In my spare time, I enjoy books, baking, and scuba diving. So since I only have 20 minutes, there's a lot I could cover here, but I can't. So I'm not going to discuss frequentist versus Bayesian statistics. I'm not going to talk about multi-arm bandits. I'm not going to discuss any A/B testing tools. There's a lot out there. And I'm not going to talk about A/B testing alternatives or causal inference. There's been some workshops and talks today about that. This is outside of the scope of my talk. So what is A/B testing and why do it? So if you Google A/B testing, the most common thing that's going to come up is, hey, you have this button, and you want to change the color of it, and you want to test how that's going to impact the conversion rate. Kind of a toy example that I'm going to go with here today, because chances are, in real world, this is not what you will be testing. So, quick reminder, again, this is something you can Google, how to design an A/B test. You usually have power, so the probability that you will detect the real effect, we usually go with 80%. P-value, oops, something wrong happened with my slide. P-value is typically 5%, so the probability that the effect is due to something random. You also need your primary metric and relative or absolute minimum detectable effect. So primary metric is just so that you know what you are trying to change with your test. You should be really clear about that up front, and we'll go into a little bit more detail. And you kind of want to guesstimate about how much that metric can move. You plug all of those numbers in, and that's going to give you the sample size. You can then use your sample size to calculate how long you need to run your experiment for. So for example, if your required sample size is 50,000 users, and you have 25,000 hitting your website every week, and you need 50,000 in actually each group, that means that you need to run your test for 4 weeks. Now, I'm going to stop talking about the buttons, and I'm actually going to talk about more of a real-life example. One that I've seen in all companies I've worked for is changing the sign-up flow. So the sign-up flow can often be a barrier to entry to your product for a consumer, user, and I've done a lot of experimentation around changing the fields that need to be filled out, reordering them, or removing them altogether. So we have this hypothesis that removing a field is going to improve sign-up rate. So for A/B testing, you can kind of state this as a null hypothesis, where removing a field is not going to change the sign-up rate. And then the alternative hypothesis is removing a field is going to improve sign-up rate. So this is very much statistics in practice. This is a module that some of my friends really hated in high school, and they always said, this is never going to be useful in real life. Well, we're wrong. So now I'm going to move into the pitfalls. So what can go wrong? What sort of things you should watch out for? What sort of things you should be thinking about when you are doing your online course in A/B testing that it may not cover? So one thing beyond the hypothesis that I encourage you to take a step back is, what is the business problem that you are trying to solve? So in our case, it would be users encounter significant friction when completing the sign-up flow. And especially in the current market, companies are tightening their budgets. So as you are thinking about proposing different initiatives, and I, as a data scientist, work both with product managers to come up with A/B tests, but I also propose my own A/B test based on the analysis I do. So it's really, really important to think about what is the actual business problem and the business value that we're solving here. We don't want to do just something for fun, although that would be great. That's just often not feasible. So take a step back, go a little bit beyond the hypothesis, go a little bit deeper and think about that business problem. Launch criteria. So we have our primary metric that we're trying to move. We have some secondary metrics. We also may have some guardrail metrics that we are trying to absolutely not break. And chances are our experiment won't impact them, but it might. So we want to look at them. So we think we're clear on this. We run our experiment. But then what are we going to do when the results are neutral? This is often a cause of conflict between data scientists and product managers. As a data scientist, I'm going to be like, look, this is not doing anything. Let's roll this back. This is not worth our time. And a product manager is going to be really keen to change this, and they may have some good reasons. So for example, there may be user research that you are not aware of. They may believe that overall this is a better experience. And one of my companies, we kind of call it the Switzerland of experiments. So we believe this is a quality of life improvement, even if it's not moving our metrics. There may be other things that you as a data scientist are not aware of, but that's not always the case. So I find it really worthwhile to, before you roll out the test, to have that conversation with your stakeholders. Okay, so what are we going to do if the metrics are not moved in either way? And a lot of the time they're like, oh, we can do a follow-up, or yes, I still want to roll it out. In some rare instances, you may actually be able to convince them that this is not a good way of building product. This is a really fun one. So you have your metrics, you get your results. It tells you, yes, this has moved, no, this hasn't moved. But a lot of the time when we're rolling out a new experience, we're adding a page, we are adding pop-ups, anything like that, we can actually learn a lot about the behavior of users. And I will talk about the template I'm going to share soon, but I like to have a section about potential learnings and what do we want to understand about our users, our consumers, through that A/B tests. A lot of the time, it can be just 1 or 2 bullet points. So data is interesting. We can spend 2 weeks digging into the data, slicing and dicing it, doing some modeling, coming up with some things. So I find it really worthwhile to upfront spend some time in thinking, okay, what are the 2 things that I can learn about users here that could then inform a product decision, that could inform strategy, that could change what we're doing next, or that could inform us to tweak the A/B tests in the future and actually change the experience to something that may be better. And I actually have done that in the past couple of months. We changed something at onboarding. Results were negative, but I added a supplementary analysis that is now resulting into a second test that we're going to roll out to our users. This is my pet peeve. So in a virtual world, you might have a product manager Slack you. In real life, you might have someone come and tap you on your shoulder and kind of ask you, can we get some directional data? And it's a pet peeve because some product managers don't really understand that you shouldn't peep or that you shouldn't make a decision based on 2 days worth of data. Some of them are just excited and just want to see that the experiment is live and how things are trending, and they understand that they should stay hands off and hold off on making any decisions until we make our final decision. So there's 2 things I've done here. One of them is more cumbersome. The other one is kind of uncool, but sometimes you gotta do what you gotta do. So the first one is education. So just doing brown bags. I've written docs about how to think about A/B testing at like a higher principle level. I have educated PMs in one-on-one meetings. Very inefficient, but can be effective. I also had one case in one of my previous workplaces where we had a product manager that just could not get it, was really derailing our conversation. We'd check in on metrics and experiments weekly. It would really derail our conversations, and we just decided to not show any results until we achieve statistical significance. Now, this is not really cool. It doesn't build trust. It is not transparent with your stakeholders. This was a call made by my manager at the time. He checked in with the head of product, who kind of signed up on us and was okay with it. But in general, the preference is to educate. You want to increase the levels of data literacy for your entire team, and hiding the results doesn't help. Another fun one. So we want to roll out our experiment to 50-50. We check in on the experiment within a day or two, and we're realizing that actually we see 70% of users in the test group, but we wanted 50%. So what do we do? Well, a lot of time it's not necessarily 70%, and it can be something like 52% and 48, 53% and 47, whatever it may be. The numbers are kind of close. So you can do something called sample ratio mismatch calculation. Plenty of calculations out there online, so I'm not going to talk you through the math. We don't have time for that. Kind of like for sample sizing. And it turns out that slight imbalance a lot of time is okay. So that may be half a percentage point. You know, if you have 40 users in one group and 42 in another in the past hour, that may be okay. Some other things you want to do is, let me see. Okay, I don't have the next slide for that. So some other things you may want to do is you may want to see if users are double bucketed. That happens all the time. And you want to make sure that each user is in one group and stays in that one group for traditional A/B testing. And sometimes that may mean that there is an issue with tracking data. There is an issue with feature flag. There is something that the engineers have messed up. It happens, and need to fix, and then we will re-roll out the experiment. You may also want to check if this has happened on a particular date. Can you track it down to a particular release? And it has happened once that there was this sample ratio mismatch introduced on an A/B test I was running, happened on a particular date. I tracked it down to a release. It had nothing to do with our experiment. It was the most baffling thing, but it helped us fix it. And then beyond that, you can go into your traditional checks and balances when something goes wrong in your report. So you break down your users by their demographic attributes. You look at desktop versus mobile. Is this problem coming from just one of those devices, one type? Is this coming from a particular market? As a data scientist, you typically know the demographic attributes of your users best, so you kind of want to slice and dice your data by those. Now, it also has happened to me that there was no way to track down that issue and figure out whether it was done by a particular user on a particular platform, anything like that. At some point, you just have to give up and just leave it to engineers. But I've even created a checklist to share with my engineers of, here are the things I will look for before I bug you and get you to fix it and make some noise. So timing, we can see some gifts. So one of the things we want to be mindful of is seasonality effects. So depending on what kind of company you are, there may be seasonality effects around particular holidays that may result in a dip of new users. I've also worked at places where we see a lot of usage and a lot of engagement on weekdays, not so much on weekends. So that's something to be mindful of. I also would caution you against setting an A/B test as a set it and forget it kind of thing, where you leave the office and you come back after a few days and hope that the results will be there, just because you won't be able to monitor if something goes wrong, like the sample ratio mismatch. And you want to know what your trends are just by looking at historical data and trends. This doesn't need to be sophisticated. You don't need a fancy model to tell your seasonality. You can just do a time series of user signups, user engagement, anything like that, and you will be able to pick up very naive trends right away. Another fun one. So you have your test, you kind of check in on it regularly, and at first you see an increase in your metrics, but then they drop. So what do you do? There's two scenarios here. So if they increase, but then they drop and they kind of level off, that may be due to novelty effects. So depending on what you introduced, users may be engaging with a button, a page, an experience because it's new. not because it's actually useful. So you may be looking at the wrong metric sometimes too. You may be looking at like page views versus the actual engagement with what's on that page. One easy way to isolate it is to look at new users, because everything is new for them. So that gives you a very clean comparison. Now, if you see an increase in your metrics at first, but then those metrics drops and they drop into pre-experiment level, you may want to, again, do your typical checks. Is your data pipeline okay? Are you seeing the data you're expecting to see? Is there an engineering bug that has happened that could affect your reports? Is this happening for a particular user? Again, the demographic attributes I have discussed. And at that point, you may also want to think, okay, at which point do we abort this experiment because things are looking really bad and we're losing a lot of users and therefore a lot of money. The next one is not a pitfall in and of itself, but there are some things that you need to consider. So typically A/B test, you can imagine there's a group A, there's a group B. Third group's very simple. Things get a little more hairy when you have more groups. So the more groups you have, and again, you can read online about science behind it. I don't have time to cover it. The chances of you getting a false positive with multiple groups is a lot higher. So you need to correct for that. One of the ways to do that is using Bonferroni correction. It's a very conservative way of dealing with it, where you divide your p-value, so 5%, or 1 if you want to be a lot more strict, by n, which is the number of groups. So 5% divided by 3 will be your new p-value for the test with 3 groups. What does that mean? Well, that means that you need to run your test for a lot longer. It's going to take you significantly longer to achieve that statistical significance in this case, which may not be ideal. You want to often move with your product, and that may mean that your product manager may be impatient. There's also other ways of correcting for that, but I would strongly discourage testing with more than 3-4 groups. I've heard of tests with like 40 different groups. I've had a product manager that wanted to run an A/B test with 12 different groups where there were like very minor changes to the UI. So I actually got them to consolidate some of them and kind of make some decisions on which of them are the highest bets that may pay off in our case. So I do a lot of mentorship, and some time ago, one of my mentees came to me and was like, hey, so my product manager just told me that they rolled out this test and they asked me to analyze it. Well, this product manager clearly thought that we have some magic in our arsenal because there was no tracking. We had no idea who was in which group. We had no idea what metrics they wanted to move. We had no way of looking at anything. It was really bad. And I had to coach her through a conversation with the product manager that she needed to have of, hey, like, we need to be looped in from the get-go. You can't just roll something out, not talk to us, not give us the things we need to analyze a test, and then expect us to work some kind of magic. That was on the very extreme side of the spectrum that I've seen. But often having some process for signing off and collaborating on an A/B test design between product, engineering, data science solves this. Another one, so users in multiple experiences and tests. So depending on how big the company that you are at is, there may be multiple teams working on the same page. That's actually relatively rare, but it may happen. Or your product manager may want to run multiple tests at the same time. Usually it's not ideal. Having one A/B test at a time kind of allows you to very cleanly attribute which changes are happening with each test. But that's not always feasible. So there's many ways you can do that. If the tests are running in different sites of your parts of your product, that may mean that you're targeting different users. That may be fine. I've also seen some ways of using regression to then attribute those users to the different experiences and the changes accordingly. This is one that my team was doing up until very recently. So writing ad hoc queries for every test. So we run up to a couple of tests per month. It can really depend. But each of them can be really laborsome because we would write queries, we would pull the metrics that a lot of the time were the same, and it would still manually compute that. This is not great. You are spending a bunch of time writing your ad hoc queries instead of doing the analysis. So reusable components are the way to go here. So the way I've seen it done, and I've worked on that in different companies, is in some of them we actually had a built-in dashboards where we would reuse them for different experiments. A lot of the time metrics would be reusable. Sometimes we would just ignore some of the metrics that were not relevant to the experiment we're looking at. And I just did that at my current company where we introduced a tool that would allow us to plug and play the results. That can save a significant amount of time. I've also seen that done, and I haven't leveraged that, just having reusable Python notebooks that can allow you to write an experiment ID to it, and it spits out a bunch of metrics that you look at regularly or reuse, and that can significantly reduce the amount of time you spend on this, with the exception of the occasional A/B test will have one metric that's very different or looks at a part of the product that we don't normally look at, in which case we would still do the ad hoc part, but the reduction in the amount of time we spend has been huge. So some best practices. So an experiment design template. This is a plug to the blog post I've written where I share Square's experimentation template that any of you can download and use. So it talks about a lot of the things I have already covered. It pushes you to outline the business problem, hypothesis, the metric. It tells you, hey, tell me when this experiment is meant to start, how many users I need in each group. It has a space for including the actual screenshots of the new experience if you want to do that. We also include a bunch of links, so PRDs, product requirements, docs, design documents that design team has created, Figma links. I also like to include links to any sort of data tracking designs. So often in testing, there is one more event or a couple more events that we need to introduce. It's all in one place. And then I also link out post-experiment analysis, which I personally like to keep separate, although there is a section that you can include it there. That means that things are very clean. It's handy to have them in one place. And we have actually gone back to some of the old experiments we've run to make a case for introducing something in a different market. And we can say, hey, we have this experiment in this other market that has worked really well. How about we replicate this approach or tweak it a little bit? And it's just very handy to have everything in one place. So some resources, Trustworthy Online Controlled Experiments, fantastic book. I have my own copy. I come back to it regularly. Has a lot of the basics of A/B testing, focuses a lot on the web, and goes a little bit more beyond the basics. And another one is How Not to Run an A/B Test from Evan Miller. He has a great website. He actually will help you, has a calculator for sample sizes on his website. There's also a chi-square calculator, t-test calculator, and sometimes if I need a sanity check, I would do that and then compare it with my Python script or something like that. So I found both of these very helpful. Cool, so that's it for me. Thank you.
So in the real messy world, how do you really validate the assumptions that go behind A/B tests? So let's say for treatment and control, the assumption is that they're identical in every other respect except the treatment. But in a scenario where you just have website visitors, not necessarily who have registered on the website, how do you really validate that assumption?
there might be a limit to what you are able to do, which is probably not what you want to hear. But even when you look at like your website and your users, and we've seen that at Medium, you can look at the referral. Like, where are your users coming from? Is there an uptick from a particular channel? You can work with marketing on making sure that there is more tracking around that. But you only know about your users what you have. So there is a limit to like what you can check, but a lot of the time, chances are you find that good enough. I've also heard about a good practice, and I say heard because I've never managed to convince anyone to do this. That's good practice to rerun the same test over time. Run it on one group of users, it's positive, then rerun it next month with a different kind of users. Again, I've never been able to get sign-off on it in reality, but that's another thing that you could, in theory, do.
I have two questions. The first one is, how much difference it needs to show in actual results to make it cost-worthy to actually change the product? The second question is, how do you communicate to people who don't understand statistics when the p-value is now hitting the target, but one group looks a bit higher?
Okay, so two questions. So first one is like, when do you decide to roll out? Yeah, that's a really, really great question. So it depends, which is a cop-out answer. But usually with tests up front, I'll kind of define what that threshold is for me. There is a cost component to it, where rolling something out may be more expensive than that 0.1% gain that you're getting. I haven't been in a situation where I've said to a product manager, like, hey, this difference is very small. I don't think it's worth rolling out. And they've never said to me, like, yeah, I agree, it's not worth rolling out. But I'm sure that there are cases like that. In the vast majority, I haven't encountered them. And again, like, I've seen a lot of product managers who are like, the results are neutral, they still want to roll things out, which, as I mentioned, I have opinions about. And your second question, not very statistically driven people. So you can educate them and kind of explain what it means, and that, like, this doesn't have your stamp of approval. You can even phrase it that way. I use the phrase directional data. I see that used a lot. Not crazy about it. You can just not show that and be like, we've seen no change between the groups, and you can simply leave it at that. So it kind of depends on the relationship you have with your stakeholders and whatever you feel comfortable with. Okay, I'm sorry. We don't have time for any more questions, but come find me.